Welcome to the Faster Podcast by FLO Cycling, the podcast where we talk about anything and everything that makes you faster on your bike. This is Season 1, Episode 7, and today we have Darryl Griffiths, the owner of Shots Nutrition, joining us on the show. Darryl, the author of Sweat, Think, Go Faster, teaches athletes how to turn race day nutrition from an issue into an advantage. With more than 20 years of experience studying sweat, nutrition, and professional athletes, Darryl may change the way you think about sports nutrition forever. Listen to this episode to learn how understanding your sweat can help you optimize your race day nutrition plan and become a faster cyclist. All right, so Darryl, thank you so much for coming on the show. How you doing today?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Good.
Nice and warm down here in Australia.
Yeah, I heard that. It's nice and warm, and we didn't get you up too early, right? It's 10 a.m. there?
10 a.m., yes.
All right, so you've had time for your morning to get going. Awesome. Wanted to talk real quick with you today. As you know, this podcast is about everything that we can do as cyclists to get faster on our bikes. And I want to talk a little bit about how we met. John and I sponsored some Aussies back in the day, and as a result, every time we go to Kona or one of the 70.3s, we find ourselves hanging out with those guys, which is always good because Aussies are nice guys and fun to be around. And it seemed like every time I was hanging out at the booths here or there, I would always see this guy kind of show up, talk to some of the athletes for a bit, and then leave. And after this happened for over a couple of years, I was like, who is that guy? So I think it was in Kona a couple of years ago, Darryl, I think we were in, I forget the booth we were in, but anyway, I came up to you and just said, hey man, who are you? I see you around. What do you do? And we chatted for a bit, and you completely blew my mind with how much you knew about sweat and how important sweat is for an athlete and how it's related to their performance. And honestly, I'm an engineer. I've done a lot of training and racing myself, and I had no idea about any of the things that you were talking about and how much of a drastic effect it could have on your performance as an athlete. So as it stands right now, my understanding is basic, and by the end of this podcast, I think it's going to be a lot better. But based on what we've talked about, each athlete kind of has their own sweat fingerprint, if you will, and there are sweat rates, and there is a concentration of sodium that an athlete loses in their sweat. So let's kind of get right into it, and let's talk about those two things. So Darryl, can you start by talking about what sweat rate is and why it matters?
Yeah, for sure. Well, firstly, sweat rate is the volume of sweat an individual loses, and that it's something that varies considerably between each athlete. You could be competing at the exact same intensity in the exact same environmental conditions, but one athlete might only lose a small amount of sweat, and another athlete might lose large volumes of sweat, and obviously that impacts on blood volume loss, and someone with a lower sweat rate will naturally prefer competing in warmer conditions to someone with a high sweat rate. So it's something that, you hear things about drink to thirst and all these sorts of things. Well, thirst for someone is going to be different for someone else, and you only need to drink based on how much you're losing. So sweat rate's a really important part of an athlete's understanding of what they require.
Okay. Very, very, very cool. Now, the other part of this equation is the concentration of, I believe it's sodium in your sweat. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that matters?
Yeah, well, so sodium from an athlete's perspective, it's the mineral that we lose most of. It's extracellular, meaning it's mostly present in the bloodstream. And it was actually, as a firefighter over 20 years ago, that I recognized that some firefighters were able to handle hotter conditions better than others. And in fighting a bushfire particularly, if you can just imagine wrapping yourself in a doona and then running down the street in the middle of summer, that's pretty much what a firefighter needs to put up with. So you see things happen really quickly in those sort of environments. And I'd recognize that some firefighters handled hotter conditions better than others. And this intrigued me because I sort of didn't seem to handle the heat as well as some fireys that I was much fitter than. I knew I was a lot fitter than them, but they could handle the heat better. So I started to test these firefighters to find out why. And so I started testing the volume of sweat they lost, but importantly, and the question that you ask about the sodium concentration in their sweat. And it turned out that the firefighters that handled the heat better had a lower sweat rate, meaning they didn't lose as much sweat. But importantly, they had a much lower sodium concentration in their sweat. And that was the trigger that got me interested in all this in the first place. And then putting that information I learned from the firefighters together with athletes. And
very cool.
Yeah. So after recognizing that and then learning that that reason for why some people are able to handle hotter conditions was then starting to test more about sodium, because in those initial tests was about testing for calcium, for magnesium, potassium, so all the electrolytes that you lose in sweat. But it became very clear that sodium was the critical component, and the variation in concentration of sodium in sweat. Now, having done well over 1,200 tests now, the sodium concentration in sweat between individuals can range from as low as 311 milligrams, and that's 311 milligrams per 1 litre of sweat. I think is that 16 ounces, or I'm not sure what that is in imperial.
We're Canadians. We're probably not the best ones to ask.
Oh, good. So you guys work metric.
Yeah, we know both. We had to learn both. So metric or we got imperial. We're good.
Perfect, because I'm 100% metric. I don't know anything about imperial. Well, this works well. So 311 milligrams per 1 litre of sweat. So for every 1 litre of sweat, that athlete loses 311 milligrams of sodium.
Okay.
And the highest that I've recorded is 3,084 milligrams per 1 litre of sweat. So there's a huge variance, and everywhere in between. So recognizing this and seeing the firefighters that were having trouble in the heat had a much higher sodium concentration in their sweat. So this is where everything started to fall together for me. And reason why these powdered drinks, these one size fits all, were never going to be something that were going to assist any of my friends that were out there in the fire, on the fire ground, having some struggles in the heat. So
wow,
it's the disparity between sodium concentration in sweat can be massive, but having that understanding of what your concentration in sodium is, you can then address your unique requirements.
Very cool. So you discussed the variance of like the actual salt concentration. You said, I think, 311 milligrams per liter up to over 3,000. What variance do you see in the volume of sweat? So you take me and you and put us through the same the same endurance or whatever, the same heat level. How much of a sweat rate could you see, like volume wise, for me versus somebody else?
Yeah, so I've done this actually quite a number of times over the years. And there's one particular test I did. We had 20, it was triathletes, well conditioned. Mm-hmm. And we did, so we wanted the intensity to be the same. So we did the test at 2.5 watts per kilogram. So whether you were 60 kilograms or 80 kilograms, you were pushing 2.5 watts per kilo. So fairly solid, but not crazy. So we did this at 27 degrees and 65% humidity. So fairly
muggy.
Yeah. So the sort of conditions that you would expect at around, the start of Kona, for example, or a fairly warmish day. This test was done for an hour. The sweat rates, and it was a mix of female and male, but the sweat rates ranged from 0.7 or 700 mils to 2.9 litres. So a huge disparity. And interestingly, people say, oh, yeah, well, I'm a girl, I don't sweat as much. Well, I've had girls in classes of 20 to 30 athletes where some of the girls had the highest sweat rate.
Wow.
So the interesting thing is that it doesn't matter gender or fitness or heat acclimation. you'll sweat a certain volume at a certain intensity at a certain environmental condition, regardless of any of those. It's not gender specific or geographically specific or anything like that. It's the cards you dealt.
Yep. What about, how does that relate to overall performance? So can you say that somebody who sweats less from a volume perspective and loses less sodium performs better than somebody who sweats more and has a higher salt loss?
Yeah.
Or is it vice versa?
Well, yeah, you will. You'll get both there. And it's interesting that you'll have athletes who will prefer hotter conditions, and those athletes who prefer hotter conditions, they'll have a lower sweat rate.
Yeah.
And they'll have a lower sodium concentration in their sweat.
Okay.
And basically, they can manage their losses far better than someone with a high sweat rate and or a higher sodium concentration in their sweat. Wow. And this is where, and I say and or because like you two guys might have the exact same sodium concentration in your sweat, but
yep.
one of you might sweat 1 liter an hour. So let's say, for example, your sodium concentration is 1,000 milligrams per 1 liter of sweat.
Yep.
Okay. And you're competing at 25 degrees and you're riding at the same intensity, and one of you loses 1 liter an hour and the other loses 2 liters an hour. Now, the concentration of your sodium is the same. It doesn't ever change. What
right.
changes is the accumulative amount of sodium based on the volume of sweat that you lose. So one right. of you who's losing 1 liter an hour will lose 1,000 milligrams of sodium an hour, while the other who's losing 2 liters an hour, even though your concentration of sodium is the same, you're now losing 2,000 milligrams of sodium an hour.
Yep.
So the athlete losing the 1 liter an hour will manage their losses far better than the athlete that is losing 2 liters an hour.
Oh, I see what you're
Very
saying.
cool.
It's the ratio, the total ratio. Yeah, that's interesting.
Exactly. The accumulative loss for that other athlete, even though the concentration of their sodium is the same, the accumulative loss will be higher because the volume of sweat they're losing is higher.
Interesting.
And so if you look at, evolutionarily, we sweat to cool ourselves, but you can actually sweating too much, and like you're saying, is a problem. So as long as we're sweating some, we're cooling ourselves. But if you sweat too much, it actually decreases your performance.
Exactly. Now, what you're governed by is what your stomach can process.
Right.
And if you think about the surface area of your skin compared to the size of your stomach, it's unlikely that you'll ever replace the amount you lose. So
yeah, exactly.
That's a really good analogy.
Well, it is. It's it also comes down to let's assume that you two have the exact same sweat rate and the exact same sodium concentration. You're losing very similar numbers each hour. Now, one of you may have a much better digestive system than the other.
Okay.
So you can have the best engine in the world, but in an endurance event, if you don't have a good stomach, it doesn't matter how good your engine is.
Yeah.
Right.
So to be a very good endurance athlete, you need all those things to fall into place. You can't have one without having the other.
Very cool.
And the longer that the event, or the longer the duration, the more important that becomes.
Very cool. Now, if you check out your site, you have a sweat test kit that's on there. Can you tell us a little bit about what a sweat test is and how it works? What are you actually doing in a sweat test?
Yeah, so the three things we want to find out, and it's more, the thing with cycling is you really can't gauge what the race is how it's going to pan out. So for a triathlete, you need to arrive at transition 2, ready for the marathon, having limited your losses.
Okay.
As a cyclist, you can bury yourself to the line knowing that that's all you need to do.
Right.
But as a cyclist, it might be your job to get on the front and work as hard as you can to try and get a break so that your teammates in the peloton can have a bit of a rest and then, save their bickies for the finish. So sweat rates, calorie expenditure is constantly changing as a cyclist. And it really comes down to how the race pans out, which will determine, how much you're going to lose. But the sweat test really is designed to gather information about what your sweat rate is based on a certain intensity. And the two things dictate sweat rate is intensity and the environmental conditions. You alter either one or both of those and you're going to get a different result. So with the sweat rate, we get an understanding of whether you're a low, moderate or high sweater. But the most important thing is that we collect sweat. We put a sweat patch on the inner forearm, on both inner forearms, and we gather sweat in that 1 hour that we then analyze. And that then tells us how much sodium that you lose per 1 liter of sweat. And for instance, if you lose 1.5 liters in that 1 hour, it'll be 1.5 times the sodium concentration of your sweat, and it tells you how much sodium that you lost in that 1 hour.
So you say you put a patch on the insides of the forearms. I mean, I'm thinking of like a sweat loss thing, and I have this envision of like wrapping myself in a big bag, like a plastic bag, and like collecting all my sweat. So are you using like a volume calculation to say, hey, we've got this amount of area on the forearm, and we then do a calculation to say the whole body loses X amount of sweat?
No, the actual sweat rate is as simple as pre and post weighing. So the athlete will weigh themselves nude prior to.
Yep.
And then so they'll weigh themselves with the bottles they're going to be drinking. And then we measure that weight, and then we do the 1 hour test. Then after the test is finished, we dry the athlete down as much as we can. And then it's a nude weight holding the same bottles that they drank. There might be, some left in the bottle. So we're not guessing how much they drank. We've got an actual net weight of their losses.
And so the patches in the forearms that are for the sodium concentration, that's what you're gathering from.
Exactly.
Very, very cool.
And so I think I saw it. It's kind of like a Tegaderm patch, right? You're just collecting
spot on. It's an adhesive patch which collects the sweat. I then use a syringe to secrete that sweat into a specimen jar. And then I use a machine that then measures the sodium concentration of that sweat.
So that's what you do after you collect it. You take it off and you actually get that concentration.
Exactly. There are machines or small devices. They use them to test for cystic fibrosis, because people with cystic fibrosis have very high sodium concentrations in their sweat.
Okay.
And all you need to do is sit there for 10 minutes, and they put this device on your forearm, and it collects the sweat, and it gives you a number. I don't do it that way because I actually want to generate the heat during activity. I don't want it to be an artificial sensory device. So there are other ways of doing it, but I like to do it this way because that way we can gauge the athlete's sweat rate as well. Because as I've explained before, it's not just having that sodium concentration number. It's also important to know your sweat rate and how that changes in different environmental conditions.
Okay, changing is in different environmental conditions. Leads right into my next question, actually. Does your sweat rate or the salt concentration change in any situation? Does our fitness level, our stress, like a stress level, humidity, age, does it change at any time in our life?
Interestingly, the sodium concentration of your sweat doesn't change.
Okay.
And I've tested athletes at different fitness levels. So the same athlete over a 12-month period, different fitness levels. We've increased their salt intake considerably to measure. We've put them in heat environments over 6 weeks to see if that changes. The literature that you read will say that your sodium concentration in sweat will reduce as you spend more time in the heat, which was the first thing I wanted to test because it's important that if that's the case, then heat acclimation would be a really important part of training for hotter conditions. But having done enough research on this now that I know for a fact now that your numbers do not change, but your perception of the heat does. Now, you're in a cold environment at the moment. if we brought you into a heated environment over the next, say, 3 to 4 weeks, training in the heat will actually increase your blood volume. You'll have more blood available.
Okay.
Now, after 4 or 6 weeks in that heat, once we test you, the numbers will be the same, but your perception of the heat will be different because you're now starting with a greater blood volume. So you've got more to lose. So the percentage of loss won't be as great. So this is where heat acclimation is great because you will increase blood volume to a certain extent, and that will assist you with training in the heat, with competing in the heat. But at some point, there's going to be someone who's just physically going to be able to handle the heat much better because they're just simply not losing as much as you are.
Very cool.
Interesting. Okay.
One of the things that we talked a little bit with Darryl before the show was that if you're in Australia, Darryl has on his site a way for you to get a sweat test. If you're in the United States, there are a number of other companies that can do a sweat test for you, but you will not be able to get that from Darryl directly. But if you wanted to do that or check it out, there are options, and we'll put some of those in the show notes for anybody that's interested.
Sweet. Darryl, so just expanding on that a little bit, as far as the test goes, if you're in Australia, you can order yours. Is there any way for athletes, is there another means for athletes to do this at home or in a lab in other countries? And if so, what is the approximate cost to do this type of study?
Well, here in Australia, it's $149.
Okay.
And I've put a kit together that I send to that person's home. And whether they're a cyclist or whether they're a runner, they'll do a test on an indoor trainer or a treadmill. It's most often needs to be in a controlled environment, so you're not contaminating the patches at all, and you're getting a number that's commensurate with your losses and not something out from the outside environment.
Okay.
And mate, to be honest, I don't know what it would cost in the US, but I can't imagine it'd be too different to that, around the $150 mark, I'd say.
Okay, very, very cool. All right, moving on a little bit. So we've got the test, we've done the tests. Now let's say an athlete has their numbers and we know how much sweat we're losing and what concentration we have is in our sweat. What is it that we then are trying to replenish? Are we trying to replenish the water and the sodium that we lose? Is that the main focus?
Yeah, so that from a hydration perspective, they are the two most important components, water and sodium. Now, This is where we come down to your stomach's tolerance and what it's able to process. Now, you will, as I mentioned, you'll never replace what you lose. So the key is to minimize percentage of loss. And after doing the test and recognizing that you might have a bit higher sodium concentration in your sweat, the first thing you'll notice is whatever you've been using in the past wouldn't have got anywhere near replacing what you lose. And I'm not saying you need to replace all that you lose, but you need to at least bridge the gap as best you can between how much you're losing and how much your stomach can tolerate. And in cooler conditions, the fact is you don't sweat that much. So there's not a huge need to drink as much as what you need to do in summer. And when we go back to those numbers about the cumulative amount of sodium you lose is based on the volume of sweat you lose, if even with a high sodium concentration in your sweat, you'll always do well in cool conditions purely because the volume of sweat you're losing isn't as much as it is in warmer conditions. And actually, I'm just going to something I wanted to mention before, because we talked about athletes that do well in the heat, and you'll know them. You'll see that some athletes will just much prefer the heat, and for whatever reason, you can't get anywhere near them on that day. Now, generally, those athletes that do really well in the heat will not do that well in the cold. And conversely, the athletes that don't do that well in the heat will do generally very well in the cold. And it comes down to, I think now, this is just my common sense answer, is that the athletes that do well in the heat function at a much higher core temperature. So their muscles seem to function at a core temperature way above what those athletes that don't do as well. Now, when those athletes that prefer the heat get to colder conditions, they simply can't get their core temperature high enough for their muscles to activate as well. And it's really quite interesting. There was, and I'll use a triathlete as an example here because it's mostly who I've worked with over the years is triathletes. I've worked with a lot of cyclists in the last 5 or so years, but there was one particular athlete who would win cold races. So he won Ironman UK, he won a race in Switzerland, another race in New Zealand, all cold races.
Okay.
So the guy had an engine that was pretty amazing, to win these particular Ironman races. He couldn't even finish a hot race. So the volume of sweat and the concentration of the sodium concentration of his sweat was so high that he was able to manage his losses in the cooler conditions. But once it got over a certain temperature, the losses were way beyond what his stomach could tolerate. And, from winning a race 1 week, he'd end up in hospital the following. Wow. Or 3 months down the track, if the temperature was 15 or 20 degrees warmer. So the having that understanding, firstly, will give you an idea of your strengths, and that if you do struggle in the heat, there's ways around managing that. But understanding your numbers first will give you a good idea of why you might do well in some temperatures and not well in others.
Okay.
Wow. Cool. So when we look at, once we know our sweat rate and the sodium loss, and when we want to replenish that, are we looking at like a 1-for-1? So if we know we lose, 400 milligrams of sodium every hour and a liter of sweat, do we want to drink a liter of water and, something with 400 milligrams of sodium in it?
Yeah, that's generally what people try to chase. But yeah, we get back to what the stomach can tolerate. And the thing is, even if you're losing small amounts like that, and losing a liter an hour was actually not difficult. There'll be a lot of athletes losing a liter an hour. No, your stomach will not tolerate a liter an hour. You will probably aim for 500 to 600 mils an hour. And that's about what your stomach's going to be able to tolerate.
Wow.
And once again, it doesn't come down to the size of the athlete. It comes down to how well their stomach responds and how good their digestive system is.
Wow.
The same thing with sodium. If you're losing 400 milligrams of sodium, you'd probably aim for 50% of your losses.
Okay. So over time, we eventually would crash because, if you did this for 24 hours.
Exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Spot on. Because it's the reason why we just can't keep going and going and going and going. It's because our stomach can't keep up with how much we're losing.
That's very cool. What is the most effective way to replenish? I know if you read like survival stuff, it's like, small sips every, 2 to 3 ounces every few minutes or every 10 minutes or whatever, or every hour versus just drinking a gallon of water. So if we're on the bike and we're trying to replenish every hour, do we want to take sips every 10 minutes? Do we want to consume it all at once? What's the best way to do that?
Yeah, you're spot on. It's how you consume it will make a big difference on how your stomach will process it. And drip feeding is the best method, and that is small amounts every 10 minutes.
Okay.
And the thing is, you can't play catch up. If you get caught up,
I learned that the hard way.
Yeah, exactly. There might be a part of the race where it might be technical downhill. It might be something that's going on in the race where you just don't have the opportunity to drink, and it might be half an hour or 45 minutes goes by. You can't then go and try and drink a huge bolus of fluid to then try and catch up, because you'll just compromise the stomach.
Okay.
It's so that. And the thing is that, there's going to be some races, and particularly probably the temperatures that you're experiencing now, that you might not need to drink anything at all. It's really dependent on how much you're losing at the time will determine how much you need to drink. So that's why no one should say to you, just drink a set volume, because it's going to constantly change. And that set volume might be fine for someone, but too much for someone else and not enough for someone else. So there's no set volume.
Okay, let's talk a little bit about, so you have a product called Shots, and we've talked about this before, and Shots is unique in some of its own ways. So talk about Shots, the tabs, and how you develop them, why you develop them the way they are, and what makes them unique.
Yeah, so that gets me back to the fireys.
Okay.
And because
for the Americans, fireys is firemen. I love the Aussie slang.
Yeah, you said earlier you were studying firefighters, and you said, imagine a firefighter wrapped in like a
Bonnie?
No, doona. Oh, you don't know what a doona is?
No, I've never heard that in my life.
Well, it's okay. What about a sleeping bag?
Oh yeah.
There we go.
Yeah, wrap yourself in or chop the legs out, or chop the bottom out, and wrap yourself in a sleeping bag, and go for a run down the street in the middle of summer.
Now I got it.
Yeah. So, it's not the sort of thing you'd want to do. But yeah, getting back to the tablets, and that's originally why I designed them the way I did, was I was recognizing the fact that what we were using at the time was a one-size-fits-all powder, which sadly is still available to athletes, which is mind-boggling to me. But so these one-size-fits-all powders have convinced us that we're all exactly the same and the weather conditions never change. But what I was recognizing was all these different sodium concentrations in sweat and these different volumes of sweat that the fireys were losing. And it made sense that if I'm getting different numbers here, I'm going to get different numbers with athletes as well. And so what I did recognize was straight away that the amount of sodium that were in these traditional powdery drinks wasn't anywhere near replacing what the athlete was losing. For some, it may do, but for most, it wasn't. And the first thing was to take the calories out of the drink and separate your hydration and your calories. That was the first thing, because calories is something that is unique to the athlete, but regardless of whether it's 5 degrees or 35 degrees, you consume the amount of calories. So calories doesn't change based on what you require. Okay. What does change is the volume of fluid that you need to consume, and that's based on the conditions that you're competing in or training in, and the sodium concentration of your sweat. And by removing the calories, it then allows the athlete to add more tablets. Now, some athlete might need 1 tablet in a bottle, but another athlete might need 4 tablets. And so that's what was the trigger for this particular electrolyte tablet, was that you could alter the amount of sodium that you required based on your needs at the time. So that was the main thing.
Very interesting. Okay, so we talked about how your stomach is only as effective as it is, and that's for the fluid and the sodium that you're getting. And now if you're doing a half Ironman or an Ironman event, you're also going to be taking in calories, as in food in a lot of cases. So digestion is often a very big problem in Ironman racing, long distance cycling events. What can you tell us about keeping these balances correct, your sodium loss and your sweat rate loss, your fluid loss? How does that relate to our ability to digest the food that we eat? And does it have an effect?
Yeah, and this is why every athlete I work with, we talk about separating calories and hydration.
Okay, I've heard this before too. So
yeah. So when you're planning a nutrition strategy for an Ironman, and you want to ride the 180 kilometers, and you've got a certain time that you want to do that in. So it's firstly understanding that, okay, I want to ride, I'll use an example here, 5 hours for 180K.
Okay.
So I've got to average 36 kilometers an hour for that 5 hours to reach the 180 kilometers. But I need to be able to ride that 36K an hour at an intensity that's not going to bury me, that, I fall apart with, 15K to go in the marathon. So it's got to be It's got to be at an intensity that you can, not comfortably, it's still got to be a solid ride, but not bury yourself.
But you can still sustain it. Yeah,
exactly. It's sustainable where you measure your effort. Now, from that, you get an understanding of what your average heart rate zone is going to be. And it might be 150 beats per minute.
Yep. And
using a device, a heart rate monitor, which every single heart rate monitor has a calorie expenditure. So, for example, if you want to ride at 5 hours, averaging 36K an hour, your heart rate zone's 150 beats per minute. So you keep an eye on that during that 5 hours on the bike. And you work out that, okay, I lose about 650 or I expend 650 calories an hour. So a calorie is just a unit of energy.
Yep.
So over that 5 hours I spend on the bike, I burn 3,250 calories in that 5 hours. Now, at what point does that calorie expenditure impact on my performance? Now, that's 2 days worth of food for some people. So it's then understanding, right, I need to know how many calories my stomach can comfortably tolerate per hour to try and bridge the gap between my expenditure of 650 per hour and what my stomach can process. So it's then in training, in key training sessions, learning what your stomach can tolerate. And it might be, let's say, 290 calories an hour that your stomach, that you learn over, a couple of month period that I feel I can tolerate 290 calories an hour. Now, there's still going to be a gap between your expenditure and what your stomach can tolerate. But the better conditioned and the better and better trained you are, the better you can handle that gap.
Okay.
And it comes down to how well you can burn your fat stores, how well you can utilize glucose in the blood, how well you can utilize the glycogen in your muscles, all those sorts of things, which is just a natural process of training. It just naturally happens. You become more efficient at all those things.
Very cool.
You get an understanding that, okay, I need to minimize my percentage of loss before I enter T2, before I run that marathon. And consuming 290 calories an hour, I'm losing 650. That is actually the best I can do. I can't do any better than that.
Okay.
Now, whether it's, and I said before, whether it's 5 degrees or whether it's 35 degrees, you're still pushing the same amount of power. So your calories don't change regardless of the weather temperature. So that's a constant. What will change is the volume of fluid that you require, and that's going to be based on how much you're losing.
Yep. But
importantly, also the accumulative amount of sodium that you might be losing. And if we use Kona as an example, on the Queen K, I've got some athletes who can lose up to 2.5 litres an hour out on the Queen K, with a sodium concentration of nearly 2,000 milligrams of sodium an hour. Wow. 2,000 per 1 litre. So 2.5 times 2,000. So they're losing nearly 5,000 milligrams of sodium an hour. So this is the sort of athlete who might need to put 3 tablets in each bottle and try their hardest to drink at least 1.2 litres an hour, which is about the maximum the stomach can tolerate over an extended period of time.
Wow. So I'm guessing there's a number of side effects to not getting this right. And so, I'm guessing cramping, digestion problems, power loss, overheating. Can you talk a little bit about what happens when we don't get this replenishing of the salt and fluids correctly?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about not really understanding cramping and why it happens. Well, I've been solving it for the last 15 years. And if someone is susceptible to cramping, they'll either have a very high sweat rate,
okay,
or they'll have a higher sodium concentration in their sweat.
Okay.
And by managing their losses better, they don't cramp anymore.
Wow.
So it's actually yeah, it's not a difficult thing to fix. It's just about understanding your numbers and then addressing them accordingly. Now, I'll just go back to that one athlete with the 2.5 liter sweat loss who's losing 5,000 milligrams of sodium. Now, the advice to him is you cannot ride at the intensity for this race in Kona than you could in a cooler temperature. You need to back your power off because you're simply not going to make it to the finish.
Yeah.
He has to have the understanding that he cannot ride at the same intensity. He can't generate the same amount of heat. He needs to try and limit his losses.
Okay.
So it's that understanding that, with your numbers, from a cramping perspective, or whether it's, now there's some athletes I've worked with who do have high numbers, who don't experience cramping, but they just shut down. They just can't continue to go. It's a different response, and it's not always cramping. It can be a whole range of different things. And there's times where athletes can have too much. And there's athletes I've worked with who have a really low sodium concentration in their sweat and down around the 300, which is, I've only had a few of those over the years. But one particular instance where this athlete was told, you need more sodium, you need more this, and she did a race in Malaysia where it's very hot and humid. It's actually more brutal than Kona. And she ended up in hospital. And she wanted to work out why, because she thought she was getting more than enough because she'd had trouble in the heat before.
Yep.
And after doing her test, she was actually the lowest. She was that one, 311 milligrams.
Oh, she's too low.
She was wow. Yeah, so she was taking too much and getting the same symptoms as someone who wasn't getting enough.
Wow.
So it can have the reverse effect. And so what we did for the following year is that we backed her sodium right off, which is actually a bit of a challenge. And anyway, she did the race in Malaysia with similar conditions to the year before, and she finished third on the podium, and
wow.
not in hospital like the year before. And
big jump, huh?
Yeah. So there's not everyone's going to have the same response, but from if someone who does experience cramping a lot, 9 times out of 10 they will have a higher sodium concentration in their sweat.
Okay. Very cool. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked a lot today about just kind of your genetics, and you're stuck with the hand that you've been dealt in a sense. So I raced for close to 10 years, and I always joked, I always said I would only race in California, by the ocean, because I could kind of guarantee it would be the right temperature. And anything over 70 degrees, I kind of fell apart. So I'm guessing I have a pretty high sodium concentration in my sweat. So for those who do have those higher numbers, are we stuck? And if we do want to, let's say somebody does really well in cold and they go to Ironman UK, they qualify for Kona, and they want to have a good day in Kona where you're just stuck with heat. What can those athletes do to try and minimize the effects that their genetics have on their performance?
Yeah, well, the first thing, they need to have an understanding of the volume of sweat that they lose based on the conditions they're likely to experience in Kona. Now, the thing is with Kona is that you'll get, you can get brutally hot and humid, and you can get quite mild days. And I'll use an example, 2013. So what I do every year, I write down how many athletes finish under 10 hours and the total amount of athletes that finish under 10 hours 30. And that's more than it's more than half the field. And
wow, really?
Yeah. And in 2013, 624 athletes finished under 10 hours. And 922 athletes finished under 10 hours 30. And it was actually a really mild day, and it was cloud cover for most of the day.
Okay.
Now, the year before, in 2012, it was actually quite a hot one. And 345 athletes finished under 10 hours. So nearly half.
Wow.
And only 651 finished under 10 hours 30. So it just goes to show you how different the temperature impacts your performance. And that's purely because in hotter conditions, you're losing more sweat and you're losing more sodium. And it's much harder to manage those losses compared with a milder day, which they experienced in 2013. In 2004, I'll just give you 2004 details.
Sure.
When Norman Studler won, 94 athletes finished under 10 hours, and only 243 under 10 hours 30. But then in 2005, 368 went under 10 hours and 651 went under 10 hours 30. 2004 was brutal.
Brutal heat.
Yeah. So you're spot on. For someone doing UK and doing well there, their hydration strategy is going to be infinitely different to what they're going to require in Kona. So understanding the volume of sweat that they lose, but importantly also the concentration of sodium in their sweat, so they can then work out what their likely accumulative loss of sodium is going to be.
So they're basically, what they need to do is figure out their personal fingerprint, if you will, of what is my best approach to managing my personal loss, and that's going to have the best effect on their performance.
Yeah, exactly. And then it comes down to what their stomach can tolerate.
Okay, interesting.
That's
okay.
So
looking at this, then I know there's some rumors going around that you've worked with some athletes in the past who have not done so well at World Championship events or in heat in general. And then after working with you, they go on to win World Championship races. So that's a huge improvement in performance. So on this show, we have something that we like to talk about. We call it Watt Points. And basically, every time we interview a guest or an expert, our goal is to see if our listeners take your advice, how much of an effect can it have on your performance? And we like to measure that in terms of watts. So let's use some simple numbers here to make the math a little bit easier. You deal with a lot of professionals. So a professional athlete, let's say in a triathlon or even a time trial event, if their objective is to hold 300 watts for their effort, and let's say that their nutrition and their hydration plan is perfect and they can hold 300 watts. If we get it wrong and we don't get our sodium concentration and our sweat rate correct because of the heat, how much of a negative effect can that have on your performance on the day? So if you're going to hold 300 watts in a perfect condition, how much lower will your wattage be if you don't get this right?
Well,
is there a percentage or just ballpark?
Yeah. Sounds like he may end up in the hospital. He may have 0 watts.
It's really dependent on the duration. So if you could probably comfortably in mild conditions where you're not losing a lot, comfortably hold that 300 watts for 2 hours.
Okay.
But at some point, your losses are going to impact on that number, and it can be a number of things. It might not be a hydration issue. It might be nutrition. It might be the calories in that, how well you utilize the glycogen storage. And I don't know how well this has been researched, but there have to be some athletes who are able to store a much larger capacity of glycogen than others in their muscle.
Right.
And the reason why they can hold a higher wattage for a longer period of time. And there's some athletes that you look at who they're not muscular or anything like that. They've got legs that they look more like skateboarders than cyclists, yet they can push out enormous power for a long period of time. But if we're talking about now, it's unlikely anyone's going to hold 300 watts for 5 hours on a bike, but it has a huge impact in regards to performance. Firstly, because when you sweat, you reduce blood volume. So that water that ends up on your skin, the fluid that is on your skin to help with the evaporation of that sweat, which helps with the cooling and keeping a safe core temperature. 80% of our blood, or approximately 80% of our blood, is water. So that water initially that ends up on our skin comes from the blood or the water component of our blood.
And that's why we're reducing that blood volume, because we're pulling the water out of the blood.
Exactly. Now, at some point, you can only lose a certain amount of blood before the brain starts to move extracellular fluid to the bloodstream to help with that, because it can't function without enough blood circulating. So there's that transition of fluid moving around, and how much energy does that take for one person compared to another. The other thing is, as the water component of your blood drops, the viscosity of your blood changes and it becomes thicker. Right. And the heart's got to work a lot harder to pump that blood around the body, and the delivery of oxygen and glucose to the brain and active muscles slows. So there's a lot of reasons why athletes need to focus, probably a lot more than they do on hydration, but also not just from during, but as a recovery. Rehydration is the single most important thing for recovery, getting that blood volume back, and then most importantly, getting that sodium back into the blood as well.
Really?
And from a sodium perspective, and I never want to be too dramatic, but if the sodium concentration of your blood drops too low, it's life-threatening. And everyone's heard of hyponatremia.
Yep. Right.
It's when the concentration of sodium in your blood drops. Now, obviously that's the extreme and it's rare, and you never ever want that to happen, but we're not talking about death here. We're talking about performance and how well the muscles are going to function, because you want to ride that bike as fast as you can for as long as you can. So addressing blood volume loss, and importantly, addressing the sodium loss are the two most critical things to how your brain and muscles function.
Okay.
So in hotter conditions, you're going to be losing more, and it's why you just can't go as deep in hotter conditions, and you can't go for as long, because those losses happen a lot quicker.
Okay. Wow. Yeah. So when we get to those points, I mean, our performance is dropping. I mean, it could be 100%, but I mean, somebody who's still able to function, we're looking maybe at 10, 20, 30% performance drop, would you say?
It can be. It can be considerable, and it can sort of creep up on you, or it can just be like hitting a wall. It's just like you can go from 300 watts to 180 in a minute. So
I've been there and done that. It's horrible.
I had no idea sweat and this had so much of an effect. It's fascinating to hear what you're saying. Just like, are you talking about like the viscosity of the blood, how that changes, makes the heart work harder? I mean, yeah, it makes sense, but like,
so I think what we'll do for this watt point is we'll just say unlimited.
Yeah, well, but it also comes down to constitution as well, and I'll name this athlete, Craig Alexander. His constitution is like, what I mean by that is he's able to hurt himself way beyond what others can, and there's a point where others will slow down. He'll be hurting just as much, but still maintain that same speed.
And when you say hurting, do you mean like he's lost too much sodium, lost too much water?
Well, the thing with Crowie is that he has an extraordinarily low sweat rate.
Okay.
So, he can manage his losses far better. It's why he's always done well in the heat, is that he's just not losing as much as someone else.
Right.
It's the same with Caroline Steffen. Now, even though she's Swiss and she's from a fairly cold climate, she just doesn't sweat much, and her concentration of sodium is low. So she'll be able to manage the heat better than some other athletes.
Wow.
And when you say constitution, that's just their ability to push. When you say pain, is that a mental capacity to the pain?
Well, I think it's inbuilt for these sort of athletes, is that the recognition of pain for some is to slow down. Some athletes can feel the same or experience the same amount of pain, but their speed doesn't drop. They're still able to.
It's funny you say that. It's funny you say that. Alistair Brownlee and his brother Jonathan, if you watch those guys take themselves to this point of absolute shutdown, which most of us just mentally can't do. It's pretty impressive to see those high-level athletes who have the ability to do that. That's a tough place to get yourself.
Yeah, it is. And working with a lot of 24-hour athletes, you see that a lot. And it is that mental side of thing and being able to tolerate pain. Now, once again, can you train that? I don't know if you can. I think it's just the cards you dealt.
Do you measure that?
Yeah, I don't know how you'd measure that.
Okay.
I'd love to know. There's also the amount of energy the brain requires as well. I work with a lot of motocross and motor racing, and that's the one thing. Like, it's extraordinarily demanding from a muscular perspective, but which you can measure, but you can't measure the energy use of the brain. Like, it's phenomenal how much information they need to process so quickly, and why some are so much better at it than others. Because you've got a motor under you, so you have to be extraordinarily fit, but the amount of information that some can process better than others at 300 kilometers an hour, there's still a big gap between the best riders and the not so good riders, even though they're on the exact same machine. That's
incredible. That's crazy. Well, Darryl, this has been an absolute mind-blowing episode, honestly. I mean, the information that you're sharing is stuff that, I mean, I'm sure 99% of the people who are listening to this really have no idea about. This is super cool. If people want to get more information on you and shots and all of that stuff, where can they find it?
I wrote a book a few years ago. It was called Sweat, Think, Go Faster.
Okay.
And it was just all the stuff that is in my head, and I wanted to get it out. So it's in a book. It's on the website, shotsnutrition.com.au, which you can. There's a Kindle version you can purchase.
Okay, and Shots is SHOTZ. Is that correct?
Yeah, Z.
Z, yeah. Canadian version.
nutrition.com.au. So there's the book on there, which is it's actually a good resource because it gets you thinking about learning about your own needs and not some article you read. And the thing is, and if I've got time, I just want to quickly just say,
go nuts.
Any sports nutrition related article, there should never be a published article on sports nutrition. There's way too many variables to consider to actually come to a conclusion. So any of these sports nutrition articles, if you change the intensity or the environmental conditions of that test, you're going to get different results. So, it probably is. I don't know much about that. I've seen numbers out of wind tunnels, but if you've got a wind in your face and it's directly at your face, and then you probably get some information from that. But how many races do you do where it's just a block headwind the whole way?
Yeah.
So it's the same with sports nutrition in that if someone comes to a conclusion, then they're drawing a pretty long bow because there's just way too many variables to consider to actually say that you don't need this or you need that. It's just so different for everyone. Everyone is so different, and
you're right.
Your needs constantly change. Yeah,
and that relates to you look at an Ironman. Right? You go to an Ironman and they give you Ironman Perform on the course. So for the athletes who seem to have that magical number that works with Ironman Perform, the number of fluid and the salt concentration that you're getting, the sodium concentration that you're getting, that's perfect. But if you're anywhere outside of the realm that Ironman Perform gives you, you could actually be at a disadvantage compared to the athletes who are getting what they need.
Well, you're spot on. Like, imagine if you rocked up to that Ironman and there was a bicycle you couldn't use your own bicycle, but there was a standard bicycle that you could not change the seat height. You couldn't change the handlebar height or anything. It was the exact same bike for every single athlete. Imagine, everyone would, they imagine the outrage. Yet they'll have a one-size-fits-all powder for every single athlete on that course.
That's unreal. That's unreal. Oh man, this is awesome. I can't thank you enough for this interview. So much good information. If you are interested in what you heard today, check out Darryl, Shots Nutrition, shots.au, right? Shotsnutrition.com.au. Okay, there you go. And the book is Sweat, Think, Go Faster?
That's it, yes.
Awesome. I got that one right. Okay, Darryl, thank you so much. This has been a blast. We'll keep in touch. I'll see you at the next event.
Great. Thanks for having me.
All right, buddy.
All right.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Be sure to listen to episode 8, where we interview the owner of Osmo Nutrition, Dr. Stacy Sims, and learn how optimizing your diet can help you become a faster cyclist. If you enjoyed the show, please help us by sharing our podcast and by leaving a rating or review. If you want to learn more about our company, FLO Cycling, please visit us online at flocycling.com. That's F as in Frank, LOCYCLING.com. You can also find us under FLO Cycling on Facebook and Instagram. Until next time, ride safe.